absolutely. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you very much for attending our next webinar in our series of practical SME webinars. Today we're going to dig into the subject of legal documents for your business, how to decrease your stress, hopefully save money, and be extremely effective for your businesses going forward. So as always, I am joined by Pete, who's going to be in charge of looking after us and questions.
Hello, Nikki.
Super. And also I'm delighted I have the lovely Diane Yarrow, who's the commercial partner at Gardner Leader, also joining us.
Hi, very glad to be here.
Super, thank you, Di. And so Di is going to be, as always, we're going to try and break it into sections, bite-sized chunks. We're going to be talking about the three following areas. So relationship contracts, which ones are your priorities to get defined in a contract and why? Secondly, policy documents. So two general categories and why do they matter? And finally, but by no means least, which documents should you be getting into order and why? The most cost and efficient way to do this, to get them all up to scratch. Okay, so I'm just going to, before we delve deep into the subject, I'm going to just pass over to Pete for the general housekeeping.
Thank you, Nikki. Once again, welcome everybody else. For the first piece of housekeeping, this is meant to be a Q&A opportunity for all of the attendees. So we will be pausing at a few set points after the relationships contracts and then possibly again before the end, but definitely at the end for Q&A. Ask any question you wish of Diane and Nikki. They've both got experience around these things, but obviously Diane's our resident expert. The Q&A, we use chat for the Q&A. And if you move your mouse around, I know we all know where it is these days, but move your mouse around, at the bottom will appear the chat button. Click it, and it will appear off to the right. And we use chat because it defaults to only being visible to me, Diane, and Nikki. So you can ask any question you want without fear of someone else in the webinar knowing that you asked it. So to let us know that you have found the chat, could I just ask a very quick question? Who here has ever borrowed a legal document from another business or off a website and made it their own? Just a simple yes.
Sure, isn't that everybody?
I'm going to be going and typing yes. I'll just do that right now. So just a simple yes or no. Let me know you found it. And while you are doing that, I'm also just going to quickly say at the very end of the webinar, when you finish, there is a very, very quick 30-second survey where we have a few ideas for future webinar topics. And we would
love John's answer. It's not me, Gov.
Not me.
I'm slightly concerned by Derek's answer, which is yes.
I saw that from Derek.
So, I mean, we've got a fairly comprehensive set of yeses. The other thing, while you're all in the chat, could I ask what you hope to get from today's webinar? And while we get that answer back, Nikki, I'm going to hand back to you.
Yeah, and I must just close my chat and stop getting distracted. So Pete's job to look after the chat and I need to do the actual chat. Okay, so, right, let's go straight in. So, Diane, just as a starter, can you just give me a little bit of background to yourself? Why are you our expert today?
Why am I the expert? So I'm a partner in the corporate commercial team at Gardner Leader, and that means that I spend my days advising businesses of all different shapes and sizes on various aspects, and a common one, probably about 50% of my time is spent advising on contracts, and all different types of contracts. So that's why I'm here.
We're very lucky to have you here.
Thank you.
Pete, are we okay to go straight in?
Yes, I think so. So we've had, I mean, just to say, yeah, pretty much everybody, there were one or two, have said yes on borrowing, which I think is perfectly acceptable, really, in the way the world works. Maybe not safe, as Diane will touch on. So to kick us off, I wanted to just ask you, Diane, you wanted to start with relationship contracts. So I guess kind of two questions, really. What are they and why are we starting with them?
Okay, so every business will have relationship contracts. And what I mean by that is how your business interacts with the outside world, specifically its stakeholders. And this is a good topic for a webinar like this because it's applicable to every business that's listening. And the stakeholders that each business will have, whilst they'll be different in terms of specifics, the common stakeholders will be the same across the group of people who are listening, really. So I thought that was a good topic to start on because I think it's something everyone can take something away from.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. Now, I think during the draft run, you and Nikki spoke a little bit about one of those stakeholder groups. I know you're going to go through them, but should we start with investors?
Yes. So investors can come in all different shapes and sizes. Investors can be people who've loaned money to your business, people who are core to the start of your business, people who are involved in your business for the longer term. But every business at whatever stage they're at will have investors. And I think everyone on the group will be able to identify who those people are for their business. And common documents that you might have with investors would be things like a confidentiality agreement, because you'll be sharing information about your business, about your idea, about where you're going and what your plans are. You might have a shareholder agreement with your investors. You might have investment agreements with them, or equally there could be some form of loan agreement or heads of terms. I imagine most people will have come across one or possibly all of those documents during their business journey.
Okay. And I think, Nikki, during the dry run and when we were originally planning this webinar, I know shareholder agreements in particular was something you really wanted to make sure that kind of your network were aware of and their importance. Do you want to just share a little bit about why? What's the experience you've had that makes you believe that?
Absolutely. So I suppose two particular examples stick with me. One example is where these particular shareholders didn't have an agreement, so hadn't taken my advice on the day one of their partnership to actually have a shareholder agreement. And unfortunately, what can often happen is people start out best of friends at the beginning, but can fall out along the way for various different reasons. So in their particular circumstance, they had no shareholder agreement. Therefore, there was no immediate remedy for what should happen with them falling out and how to resolve it. In this particular, to make sure it's a short story, so I don't go on an hour on this, but the short story is, luckily I was able to mediate between them and was able to get them to a point where they carried on. However, at one point it did get a bit hairy that they were on the cusp of going, they'd already had talked to lawyers, and they'd been advised that if they'd had to go right through the court process to get their issue resolved, it would have cost them at least 20 grand each. So all that time, stress, effort and money, whereas if they'd gone and seen Gardner Leader right at the beginning, paid a few £100 or even a couple thousands if they wanted to make it a bit more complicated, they could have sort of saved all of that aggro. And of course I did charge for my mediation time as well, so they would have saved even more. The other one though as well is what I've seen is when you don't actually understand what you've got in your shareholders agreement. So particularly when you're coming to the point of selling your business, what's a really good idea, I won't say the right legal terms so Di can correct me, but there can be some particular legal terms to make sure that if a majority agrees, the others has to follow with them to make sure that the sale can happen. If you don't have that though, or you might have implicit terms saying, oh, actually you need 100% of your shareholders to agree to a sale, that can be a real problem if you've got lots of little shareholders that may not be, that want to interfere at that point. So, which of course they have that right to if that's what the shareholder agreement says. But usually what's best for, hopefully what is best for the company is what the directors are proposing with that potential sale. So there's, it's actually understanding what actually is in the agreement, but also having one in the first place.
Yeah, and I think that's a couple of themes that from when we did the dry run, Diane, I think you were bringing out as we were talking about all of the different contracts. It really boils down to when you need the legal documents, and if it's not up to scratch, it is a massive problem.
Yes.
But on the flip side, if you've got the right legal document in place, it can actually be advantageous to you in when it comes to a sale, especially. Do you want to just expand a little bit on these relationship contracts for investors?
Yeah. Sorry,
around
Pete.
where the value is and what you would recommend people really think about.
Yeah, and I think the purpose of any sort of relationship contract is really to manage expectations. Firstly, it's a good check-in on whether everyone's actually in the same page as to their expectations. With an investor, you're looking at a short to medium-term relationship and what happens at various points in time along the way. If, for example, as Nikki said, a sale happens, what's the process for managing that? If somebody wants to leave, what's the process for managing that? It really is an important step in a company or a business's journey, whether it's a partnership or a company, just to think through what do we want to happen in all of these different circumstances. And the reason for doing it at the outset is you're doing it in the absence of emotion and in the absence of the other pressures that might weigh when one of those things happens. Some people describe them as a bit like insurance policies, so they put them in a drawer and forget about them because your business will probably operate and run without you needing to refer to it very much at all. But it's there for when one of those triggers happens. You know, what did we agree we would do at the outset? And at a very basic level, that's why they're most important, because you've thought through all of these things that might happen. And for every business, it will be slightly different. And some people want really expansive shareholder agreements that cover every possible situation, and others say, actually, I can't afford that now. I just want it to do this. So just thinking through what is it that the key things you want your document to cover is an important step, really.
Yeah, and I think having been around business owners pretty much my whole life, I've seen them come into play, and it really does boil down to often the decision making process. Would that be fair? It's how do you want to make decisions amongst yourselves? If you're going to keep it simple, just decide that. And
even deciding that can be quite an interesting conversation for people, because if you've got different people with bringing different things to the party, or having different expectations about what they'll get back in return, it's just key to go through that process of going, actually, what do we all want? And some people want decision making control, some people want money, some people just want to have a say, and they're not so fussed about anything else, but want to know clearly what will happen if they leave. Everyone will have a slightly different thing they're concerned about, but going through the process of even just talking about the document helps you to crystallize some of those.
I would just finally say as well that what you agree at the start of the business may not also be appropriate, say 10 years in, because you're at a different stage of growth. There might be different investors at that point and other different stakeholders. So it isn't something that you can just go, right, tick, it's done. You do need to review it occasionally as well to make sure it's still appropriate.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Much like a will, they sort of say do a will for the next 5 years. Your business might be quite static and it might not change very much. You might think, actually, this is fit for purpose for a long time, but other businesses, they won't. They'll have different stages that you need to go through and cater for.
Yeah. No, and that's, again, a theme I think that's going to come out as we move on. So we've had, I'm just going to take a second here. We have already had a question come into the chat. Just to remind everyone, as we go, if the questions occur to you, please just drop them in the chat, because we're going to be going through quite a lot. And when we pause to Q&A, it's up to me to really bring them to life. So just drop and forget in the chat, if that makes sense. But let's move on from the investor agreements, stakeholders, sorry. And what were the other 3 types of stakeholder you felt people should think around? And what type of contracts do you need to consider for them?
Yes, there are, and to clarify, that other businesses, depending what your business does, you will be able to identify already different stakeholder groups. But every business will have customers. That is your route to market. And with your customers, you'll need to think about how you manage that relationship. What does the customer expect? What are you committing to? What are your timescales? What are you getting paid, and when? So whether that's kind of quite straightforward terms and conditions, more complicated terms, or a fully fledged supply contract, that's the sort of thing you need to think about with your customers. Really, just how do you document that customer process? You then have your employees, because obviously they're the people that will enable you to deliver whatever it is that you're bringing to your customer group, and they're the outward face of your business. again, depending on where a company is or a business is on its journey, will depend how complicated or comprehensive you want those documents to be. But the very basic requirement is a Section 1 statement of terms, and that's a document which enables an employee to understand how much they're getting paid, where they work, how much they have to work, what sort of holiday they get. It's quite a simple document. You can probably get those, borrow those from other places, or people might have a need for a more complicated or comprehensive contract. And then there's things like, handbooks and policies and the sorts of things that you want to wrap around what the employee is doing, and, what are the processes in your business that employees need to be aware of and to abide by, for their benefit as much as the businesses.
Yeah, and we're going to touch on those in a while, aren't we? In a lot more detail.
Yes.
Yeah. So so far we've had three, I suppose you call them individuals almost. There's the individuals investing, there's the individuals who are your customers, and then there's the individuals who are your employees. And then the fourth one, I think, was sort of a bit more of a B2B type.
Yes, the fourth one can be quite an interesting conversation as well, but it's your supplier group, and businesses will have a host of suppliers, from where they buy their stationery and paper, how they might access water, through to licensing, the landlord. There'll be all sorts of people that supply your business, and looking at each of them and thinking, actually, what do we have in place with this person? What do we need from them? How quickly do we need it in order to meet our customers' expectations? And how have we documented this? It's a really important part of the process. With suppliers, it can be a difficult conversation, because what you want and what the supplier is prepared to give you will entirely depend on the bargaining power between the parties. But you might have a lease or a license from your landlord. You'll have intellectual property and sort of software licenses that will allow your business to operate. You'll have pure kind of supply terms and conditions, or you might have a purchase contract if you're in a position of sufficient strength to be able to say to the supplier, I'm going to buy these from you on these terms. There'll also be things around confidentiality, particularly if you're asking other people to do things for you and you need to keep the details of what they're doing confidential. And a number of businesses will have contractors in place. So they might operate on a contractor model, and rather than having employees, they might have people who are generally self-employed that work for their business, and I'd count them in the supplier category as well.
Okay, yeah. I think so. There's a raft of individuals, and it's quite complicated. It already feels complicated to approach this raft of things that need to be looked at. During the session, we talked about the growth phase and the maturity phase, and how what you should be doing is slightly different. Where your focus should be put is slightly different. And I was wondering, Diane, could you just talk about it, and then maybe Nikki, you could explain from your own experience how you approach things differently during the growth phase of Gorringe and this more mature phase. So, Diane, how should people in the growth phase approach this potentially huge list of contracts that need sorting?
So I think in the growth phase, you're most commonly the conversations we have with people are focused around how they're funding the business, who the key people are that are investing in their business and allowing their business to develop, but also then where the revenue is coming from, so who their customers are. And commonly, you have limited time, so you can't focus on everyone, and you probably have limited resource in terms of funds because you're starting your business and you're developing it. So most people tend to focus on those two groups in that very initial stage of their business, and that will change as the business develops. But just thinking about who the investors are in your business and making sure you know what they expect from you and what you're supposed to deliver. And then with customers, the key things are around what are you committing to, not over committing, and making sure that you're going to get paid in the way that you expect, when you expect, because all of that allows your business to grow and develop.
Yeah, and I think, Nikki, what's been your experience of that?
It's sort of fairly similar. The things that I've noticed, certainly, that we've had to focus upon as our business has matured, two key things straight away come to mind. Is one, with clients, we've updated, our terms and conditions and our letters of engagement, because as things do mature and change, and different, you do need to have slightly different requirements and things. So we part of our compliance, though, with our professional body is we do have to look at our letters of engagement every year. So that is a regular review that we do. But the second thing, which is quite administration heavy, is as we gradually start supplying larger and larger clients, we have to go through much more detailed procurement processes. So, and in those, we have to provide a lot of different policies that we wouldn't have previously had
Which
to
is
worry
going to lead
about.
us nicely into the next section, actually, of this, with the policy document. So I'm going to come back to you on that one, if that's okay, Nikki, because I think that's going to be very pertinent. In fact, we may come back to that before Diane kicks into it. But Diane, Nikki touched there about that transition phase. So we've covered the growth phase, and then there's the maturity phase. And from what she was saying, there is almost a review point. So how do things different in the review in the maturity phase when it comes to these documents?
Yeah, so in the maturity phase, you've gone through what might be a slightly bumpy journey of getting your business started. You know it's viable. You probably have a plan of where you're going and how you're going to get there. And for a lot of people, that plan involves actually, this might be my end result and this is where I want to exit. So you're looking at everything that around your contracts is helping you with that final exit, if that's your aim, or is helping you to continue delivery. So you're looking to really get stability into the business, and contracts can help with that because you have the assurance that people are committed and everyone, as I said before, is on the same page with what's expected. And then ultimately, if you're looking at an exit, you're looking at how you convince a third party that the value you're requesting for your business is worthwhile. And part of that is delivering secure supply chains, it's delivering secure customers, it's delivering a really well organized business that has everything in a row. And people take really different approaches to it. I've been given the keys to a room as part of due diligence, told, well, our contracts are in there, and you think, well, I don't know where to start. Or you get people who say, we don't have any signed contracts. I've got some terms in the back of an invoice. Or you've got people who are really diligent about it, and they give you a list of all their customers when everyone's signed up. And it's really surprising the different approaches that people take to contracts. But ultimately, it can help to assure a buyer of value, and it can help you to deliver a company that's, saleable without you.
Yeah, I was going to say, I assume those people who had a lock and a key or the backs of terms and conditions, their negotiation phase with a buyer was perhaps a little more negotiating than the person who just provided a list of there's everything, all the I's crossed and the T's dotted.
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely, it's absolutely true that a seller that's really organised and can deliver everything in an organised way will have an easier ride of a sale process. The thing is, businesses, you have so many different priorities that for some businesses, contracts just really aren't at the forefront of their priority list. And, there's a time for looking at them. And I think every business just needs to think about, where am I on that? Have I looked at them? But I know we'll get onto that a bit later.
Yeah, well, okay, so what I'm going to do is we're going to stop for questions now. We've already had a few come through, which I'll pick up in a second. Please pop them in the chat if you've had any others off this section, but I'm just going to very quickly summarize what I think you've told us there, Diane. So effectively, you have 4 groups of stakeholders: your investors, your clients, your suppliers, and your employees. During the growth phase, you should really put a lot of your attention into those first 2, your investors and your customers. From the investor's perspective, it's about agreeing decision-making process, making sure that whatever happens, things go wrong, there is a way through it that doesn't freeze the business with indecision or completely just cut off capital coming in. And then when it comes to your customers, you want to make sure that you're going to get paid and that you don't overcommit yourself and thus strangle your potential for growth and your agility. The phase after this, the maturity phase, comes once you've kind of settled, you know what you're selling, you know how you do it, you know where you're going with it, and you've got a rough plan, an objective. And then it's about securing the investors, and it's also about setting your business up so that, depending upon your exit plan, it should be a nice smooth ride rather than I can think of a few unpleasant words to describe it, but a busy period in the run-up to a sale, or even worse, the busy period after you start negotiating and you start seeing your price drop. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, that's a fair summary. And there'll always be exceptions to that, but that is a fair summary of the things that we most commonly see people focusing on.
Wonderful. Okay, well, let's go to questions now. So the first question, which I typed in, how should someone approach the conversation if they need, or they feel they need to review a shareholder agreement with their partners? So I get the impression from the way that question was asked, it's maybe, I think we need to look at this, ladies and gentlemen. I'm not sure whether or not you do. How should they approach that conversation? Any advice?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, if you would like to make changes to your shareholders agreement, it's going to have to be consensual, so everyone will have to agree. So I think an open discussion around, what are our plans, what are our expectations, where are we going, have those differed and changed from where we were when we signed our shareholders agreement. Actually, does it still meet our needs? And is it still appropriate for where we're going? We have a shareholder agreement questionnaire, which is intended to just take people through all of the different things that a shareholders agreement could cover. Perhaps something like that would be a useful starting point for the person that would like to make changes, because then you can better articulate what those changes are that you'd like to make or that you think should be updated. But I think trying to keep it as a very sort of unemotional, actually practical conversation about why it's in everyone's benefit to make those changes, because you need everyone on board anyway. I mean, there might be circumstances where the changes are a bit more controversial and that's more difficult. But I think as far as possible, a sort of calm, open discussion about plans, about the future, about your business planning. Because a shareholders agreement is part of business planning. It's really just backing up what you're all saying you're going to do and what you're going to commit to the business.
Yeah, and I think that's Nikki, I'd also like to get your opinion on this, because I know you do a lot with business planning with your clients, and obviously you've been a mediator when someone perhaps left a little late to have this conversation. Do you have any advice?
If there are only a few shareholders, it's a much easier. Well, it's not necessarily an easier conversation, but it can be a quicker one because you can get them all in the room. If there's a lot of different shareholders and perhaps they're not actually involved in the business, they got their shares a long time ago, it can be more tricky because, but the important thing is to just persevere with it. So, you can always call shareholder meetings and everything as well to try and get them in a room or a Zoom. To do that, but yeah, it's just having to also them understanding why you're doing it can also help as well, because otherwise they might just think, oh, it's just admin, it's not really important. If they can see there's a potential benefit for them doing it, i.e. it's securing the business so that it can go and get some more investment or a full sale, then they may be more incentivized to get on and do it.
Yeah, so like anything in negotiation, find the positive for them, and then put that forwards. No, I agree with that completely. Diane, you mentioned a questionnaire there. Is that something that's freely available, or is that? Yes,
I can provide it to you, and then it could be circulated. Yeah, that's no
okay.
problem.
Well, I tell you what, just pop a number 1 in the chat if you would like to see a copy of that, and then anybody who asks for it will send it. Anyone otherwise we'll let it be. So
I have a sort of follow-up question to that though, because if you do have, you might have founder shareholders and that at the beginning, and they all do understand the business quite well, etc. When you look at much bigger businesses, that what's the process there? Is there possible to have, say, a 2-tiered shareholder agreement, or shareholder agreement just for the main shareholder, the larger shareholders, and you don't have one for the lower one, the smaller ones? Is that a common practice, or how would that normally work, Di?
It's entirely possible. You can have shareholder agreements that just deal with the relationship between certain key shareholders. We often, if we're having conversations with people like about situations like that, we ask, why is everybody else not involved? And it's quite a careful balance, because you have to be careful you're not disenfranchising people, and looking at why they're a shareholder, why they're important, and why you're not including them. People can get quite emotional about shareholder agreements and about what language is used, the founder language, or how their shares are described. So it is one to tread carefully on, but yes, ultimately they're so flexible. You can deal with very specific things between a couple of people, or you can deal with absolutely everything between everyone. They're really a flexible tool. There's definitely no standard. I get asked a lot about standard shareholder agreements. There isn't such a thing. It's a question of what your business needs and how that could be best approached for you.
Yeah, I know someone recently who was has gone into a partnership with someone, but someone's bringing a lot of experience, but won't be doing a lot of the work or taking much of the risk, but doesn't want to be trapped in a situation where he can't make decisions. So and the other one's doing all of the work and taking all of the risk, but doesn't have the experience. And they've found a way to set up their shareholders so they have equal decision-making power on things, but the share balance for income and dividends is swung much harder towards one way. So it can help solve challenges like that, can't it, really?
Yeah, absolutely. They're definitely not rigid. They can be a really flexible document. But I think the key to that is understanding what you want and why you want it, and making sure that everybody wants the same thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, swinging from a relatively big question to a relatively small one, and then we'll press on. We have had more questions. I'll pick those up in the second Q&A. I just want to make sure we get through the chunk of the presentation. So someone has asked, and I think I know where this has come from. Do online signatures for customers, are they binding? Is that true, or
Yes.
are they actually a little bit less? Okay. Well,
they are. They've come into their own, to be honest, during lockdown. They can be trickier if it's so how the document is signed physically, whether it's online or in person, what we call wetting, it doesn't change the formalities around how the document needs to be signed. So if a document has to be signed with a witness, it doesn't matter if it's online or if it's in person, it still needs to be signed with a witness. And the platforms for signing haven't necessarily kept pace with that sort of thing. So they're a bit rigid. They all anticipate one signature on one page and a date. So there are situations where physical signing is much easier, and I'll be doing one this afternoon, I think. But yeah, they're binding. Some people kind of do their contracts by an exchange of emails. A contract doesn't just have to be printed pieces of paper with a signature on them. You have to be quite careful if you're communicating expectations by emails. Those, that can form a binding contract, but certainly electronic signatures on documents like Adobe Sign are binding. So and they've been really useful during lockdown.
Yeah, no, they've come into around for us as well. We've gone for e-sign, which now you've said it, I do recognise doesn't seem to have a witness feature, or if it does, I'm not sure if it conforms to what.
No, you end up sending duplicate links out. It's all very messy.
Very, yes.
But I think if businesses are moving towards electronic signing for everything, just check in on the documents you're using and just think about whether they might need tweaked at all. Do they work electronically?
Yeah. Does it ask for a witness? Does it need to ask for a witness? Yeah, those sorts of things. Okay. Well, thank you for those questions, everybody who submitted them. We've had several people request a copy of the questionnaire.
No problem.
So there's going to be some interesting conversations potentially happening in some businesses around the Southeast soon. Let's move on. So after relationships, so people orientated, the other big chunky element that we talked about was policy documents. So again, would you like to just maybe touch on how to think and start segregating these up?
Yes. So as I said, relationship agreements are really the external facing part of your business. How does it interact with others? Policy, think about it as what do we do internally? How do we regulate ourselves internally? What is it? And some of it's documenting common sense, but it's what is it that we do internally? And some of those things are things that you legally should have to operate. Things like a privacy policy. There's been lots about data protection. It's changed since Brexit. Businesses should have a privacy policy. They should be able to demonstrate and explain to an individual whose data they're dealing with how they will deal with that, how they'll look after it. And look at lots of different websites. You'll see lots of different examples, but a privacy policy is a really good example. A cookie policy on a website, that's something you're supposed to have. Things that you also are supposed to have, we touched on kind of employee handbooks earlier, but they're kind of more external. But continuity plan, I mean, COVID has seen lots of us have to change how our businesses work fundamentally and how we operate. So whilst a business continuity plan isn't legally required, it's just an extremely good idea to have thought through what will we do in these circumstances.
With the continuity plan for some professional practices, it is a requirement for their oversight. Just to anyone who is wondering, but so we have to have one for us to be regulated by our various bodies.
Yes, and anyone who's audited, there'll be different thresholds and different policies that you're supposed to put in place if you're audited as well. And that's quite a common instigator for people putting policies in place. The others will be policies that, whilst you aren't required to have them, whether it's a legal requirement, a professional requirement, or a sort of audit requirement, they're things that your customers might require you to have. So if you deal in a big supply chain, your big customers or people that you're dealing with will want you to have things like modern slavery, anti-bribery. They'll want a robust privacy policy, not just something that's quite short. And they want to see how you deal with all of their data they're passing down the supply chain. So that's not a legal requirement, and some businesses choose not necessarily to have them, but it's a requirement that your customers will want to show. I mean, some businesses will have all of these things thought through, but they won't necessarily write them down. But if you're in a big supply chain, you'll have to demonstrate that you've got all of these things in writing and that they're kind of well thought through and up to date.
Yeah. Okay. So a few things to unpack there, and if I can ask first, the ones about legally operating, is there any kind of checklist that you guys have at Gardner Leader that kind of just says these are the things you need?
We don't actually, but we can put one together. I spend quite a lot of time talking to businesses about their business, just getting to know them. And after that, often we say, actually, these are areas that you should focus on. These are things that you should have. And then people choose when and how they might implement those. I think, Nikki, you said people at the FSB might have information available about the sorts of things that people need.
Yeah, some different membership bodies like that do have some legal libraries and things which people can help, or like fresh
there's the rec for recruiters, isn't there?
Whatever it is that oversees them, they give lots of different documents to their hairdressers and stuff. There's lots of different professional bodies that do give stuff, so you're not always having to reinvent the wheel. So so they can often be a good starting point.
Yes. So a good place. So would you suggest, Diane, that a good place for anyone who is looking at a bit of an empty folder in their structure that's titled legal documents, best place to start, Google legal documents and your industry?
Yeah, you can do that. A lot of people get a lot of advice from Google. Treat it with caution.
Obviously, yeah, I wouldn't base my legal decision.
Yeah, it's a good place to start.
But going to if you're a member of the FSB or Chamber of Commerce or professional body, go to there first.
Go there first. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I agree with that, and I have acquired things from the rec before for recruiters. Okay, so that seems to be the best way with that. They are what they are.
Another thing that you could do, which I did right at the beginning, is go to your competitors' websites.
Oh my word!
What things they have on there.
That's technically called research.
Yes, researching what they do. Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, actually looking at what other people are doing in your industry, look at a business that you admire, see what they have. And because policy documents are internal, you won't get a feel for all of those, but you'll get a feel for what's on the website. The requirements around what information you need to put about your company name, VAT number, that sort of thing. There are legal requirements around that. So yeah, looking at businesses that you admire and see what they do is a good starting point to try and get some idea for yourself of what you're supposed to do. Equally, having a conversation with a professional, with your professional body, you might get more idea there. I mean, it very much depends what your business does.
Yeah, and I think we'll draw a line under that section if we can, because I'm interested in, and I suspect some of our attendees might be interested in, the bit where customers want to see policy documents. Those sound even more interesting to me than the legally required ones. So, I'm not sure who's the best person to ask this question, really, you or Nikki, but what type of businesses start asking for these policy documents in a way that, the deal is hinged around them to a degree?
Yeah, well, I mean, we've started working for a lot of bigger companies. So ones that might be, they'll be audited companies, or they might be adhering to different ISO regulations or whatever else like that. If they are larger companies or themselves adhere to those particular types of regulations, they will tend to make sure their supply chain does have certain documents, so such as the bribery or the anti-slavery, etc. or data policies. So that's where you start seeing it. If you're just dealing with, you're engaging, if you're in a plumber doing some work for a general domestic house, you're not going to have to do those kinds of things. But when you're talking about more corporate side, you will start to encounter that, and you'll have to go through that process to get onto their to their ledgers so that you can actually be engaged and to be paid.
Yeah. Diane, what have you seen? Echo or anything to add?
Yeah, I think that's a fair summary. If you're starting to deal with businesses in a different industry, they might have industry requirements. If you're dealing with listed companies, they will have requirements they have to pass down their supply chain. So whilst those things might not apply to your business directly, they'll apply to the supply chain. If you're dealing with a business that has a really strong environmental focus, they'll want to know what you're doing around environmental things. So all of those things will apply. And recently we have been talking to businesses about their data privacy policies, and they've been having questions from customers who are based in Europe to say, well, what are you doing because of Brexit? How is that changing your approach to my data from Europe that you're taking in? And we've had to kind of formulate some answers, whilst actually the decision on whether the UK is a safe place or not a safe place is decided. We've had to kind of formulate answers that keep those people happy and allow the procurement process to continue. And the businesses are looking at their privacy policies. So it depends. It comes from lots of different areas, but generally, yeah, if you're in a supply chain with a big company, I would expect to have scrutiny applied to what policies you've got internally.
Yeah. Do you have? I'm just curious, given what you do. Are there certain policies that seem to catch businesses out as they start? Do people come running to you desperately needing XYZ policy because they're halfway to finishing a deal and they've just turned around and said, oh, could you send so and so?
Some do. Audited businesses tend not to, because going through the process of getting your audit, whether it's ISO 27000, whatever it is that applies to your business, you've probably scrambled to get things together for your audit in the first place. So lots of businesses have that. We see a lot of people talking about data protection. It's surprising how many people don't have a privacy policy. That normally comes up when they've had some sort of request from someone for their data, and they kind of go, oh, what do I do? And how am I supposed to respond? They say, well, where's your policy? Oh, I don't have one. So yeah, lots of people kind of around that, really.
Okay, yeah. So those things tend to be to be what catch people out. All right. Just before we move on, someone has perfectly described what you were saying earlier, Nikki, about borrowing others. It's known as swipe and deploy strategy. Rob Pickering. So thank you, Rob. It's always nice to have a contribution from the audience. I mean, we touched on this already before, really, about policy documents. They don't just have of interest to customers, do they? They also still, if you have an exit plan, they are of interest then to potential buyers. Is that right, Diane?
Yeah, that's fair. So policies can do a few things. They can set you apart from your competitors because you have this great group of policies that you might be very open and public about. You might talk about your environmental impact. You might talk about your sustainability. You might talk about how you deal with your people. So policies can perform that function. But equally, as we talked about with contracts, a business that can easily show copies of all of its policies suggests it's a well-run business, and it suggests that it is organised, it's thought about these risks. So really they're about mitigating risks in the business. Have you thought about these things? How do you actually deal with them in your business? Do you have a continuity plan, and have you tested it? They're all questions that are coming up on deals that we do. Well, the deal I'm doing at the moment, the continuity questions come up quite a few times. What have you done around COVID? How did you get people to work out of the office? How have you approached it to meet the regulations? All of those sorts of things are live questions that we're helping clients to answer.
Okay. No, I think that's a challenge that never goes away, really. And is this something that follows the similar pattern to the first one, where there's a life stage, business life stage difference that you pick them off sort of in a predictable order, or does it really depend upon you, the customers you deal with, and so on?
It very much depends on the customer. Some businesses would like to bury them at the bottom of the pile and never think about them because they've got, customer concerns and supplier concerns. They've got business to run. other people dedicate a bit of time to doing them one by one and say, okay, we're going to need all of these things, let's just get them done. Some people get a cookie policy when they build their website. There might be trigger points that make people think about these things, and they say, actually, if we're doing that, let's do that as well. So it very much depends on the business that you're talking to.
Okay, so if I can, again, I'll do a nice little summary here before we move on to our final section, which is if you've realised in the scope of this webinar that maybe things need to be fixed, what do we do? If I can summarise, then your policy documents, some are legally required. Best approach there is to go to your industry body or the REC and FSB and just make sure you've got all those sorted out. Privacy policy should probably be top of that list, because it is one of those that it's not really a thing until you need it, and then it's quite an important thing. And then following on from that, it's be led and aware of what your target market is predictably going to ask you about. If you're breaking into a new industry, one of the things you should think about is, are we going to need new policies and so on? Because I guess these things do tend to come out quite late in a tender process, almost as an assumption, and they can catch you out, and then quite expensive to remedy. Plus, good policies make for good business. I think that's something we haven't mentioned, but it's worth bringing up. Okay, so final section then. People don't have their documents in order and have, to their horror, realized this as part of our webinar, so we've made people feel good. What should they do?
Okay, so you might find you've got a business which has more policies, more documents, more contracts around than you realised. The business might have invested in contracts and policies in the past. So the first thing I would do is really look at, do an audit almost of what you have got. Look and check in with people in the business to see what they're using, and look and check in to see what might be on file somewhere lurking around. So just check what you have got, do a full audit, so you can say, actually, this is what we use for customers, or these are what we use for customers, and none of them are the same. These are the policy documents we have, just so you've got a list, so you've got a starting point. And from that starting point,
I was just thinking, it's a good point, because you might find that you've got departments that are using different versions of set of policies, not being consistent in your organisation.
Or even contracts. You do find that some people in a business might use a contract that they used last time because they liked it and it got into a good position, but someone else uses a different starting point. And if you'd say, what's your customer contract, and are they all on the same terms, the answer often is no, because they all started from slightly different places. So I think just an audit, assess what you've got so that you understand what it is that you're looking at, and the kind of then you can prioritize what you need.
Okay. Is that, just out of interest on that one, is there something inherently right or wrong about having different terms for different customers? Or is it not inherently wrong, it's just depends if that's what you want?
It's not wrong to have different terms, because all contracts will be bespoke. I'd say it's not ideal to be using different starting points, because if you have different starting points, you can never commonly say, generally our policy is this, because you might have different contractual terms that are consistently being used. It's better if you can make everything consistent with customer variations, rather than having your own variations and then customer variations on top, because that just makes it quite hard to manage from a sort of contract management process.
Yeah, okay. Nikki, out of interest, is this something you've been through, or have you been fairly good as you moved through the growth stage yourself?
Ad hoc. So, some of it's we've had to do anyway because of our professional memberships. So certain things that we've been, really hot on from the beginning. And other things because of the sector we're in that we are really on top of, say like anti-money laundering, the Bribery Act, those sorts of things we have to adhere to really carefully because of the sector we're in. So we're really, really strong on that, and we have a regular audit on all of those sorts of things. A few things, I could say I would like us to do better, but as Di says, sometimes you just have to prioritise your customer and supplier requirements to the in-house housekeeping. So yeah, but the key thing is just reviewing it regularly.
Yeah, I think once you know everything that you have, you can make an educated and informed decision about what you're going to do something about.
Yeah,
rather
we
than
share all our documents together, so all the team have access to the same ones, so we get that consistency. And they can't say that they don't know that we've got such and such a thing. So it's all there and available. But you know, there is always some things that you want to. There's always something on your shopping list that you think, oh, I do want to have another look at that at some point.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that moves us on nicely now. So, Diane, once you know everything you've got, and ideally you've put it all in one place, what's the next step?
I'd then review what those things say that you do to assess whether it's actually how you operate. An example is a client came to us to update a specific question on their terms and conditions. So we started having a conversation about them generally. And they kind of went, no, we don't do that. You're like, okay, but this is what it says you do with customers. This is your customer journey. This is how it says you'll invoice. This is how it says you'll quote. No, we don't do any of those things. We've never done those things. You think, well, this contract's entirely not fit for purpose. It doesn't reflect at all the reality of how you do business. So just review how you operate. Think about your process. Think about, you know, whether you're selling to individuals, you're entirely B2B. Think about how all the processes work, and then do the contracts reflect what that says, what your process is, because if it doesn't, then you need to change it.
What happens if they don't reflect? So I would guess, and I'm presuming others would guess this, that any customer who's got that kind of contract where none of the things in it were done can effectively start to argue breach of contract, non-applicability, all these sorts of things. What's the worst case scenario there?
Worst case scenario is if a contract pins your pricing to how you'll quote, how a quote is accepted, and you find through the process that isn't how it was done at all. You have a really difficult conversation over price. Right. That's the worst case. Or if a contract says you'll deliver in a certain way and you deliver in a different way, then that might have implications for your warranties that you're offering and for timescales. There are all sorts of different implications. But yeah, I think if a contract doesn't work, if it doesn't reflect how you do business, then it's unlikely to help you if you get into a dispute with the customer. Right.
Okay, so basically just puts you on the back foot. Potentially puts an aggressive person on the front foot.
Makes life a bit harder.
Just, yes, as so often is the case. Number 3, step 3 we talked about. So you've reviewed, you realise it perhaps doesn't quite work, and you've decided it's important enough to do something about. What's the best step forwards?
I would prioritise. I'd look at what you need to do first. You can't do everything at once. You've got, business to run, you've got other things to do. So I'd pick some specific priorities and then almost work down your list. So think about, what do we need from our review? And then how should we prioritise those things so that we run through the list most effectively? Maybe delegate it, get other people involved. It doesn't have to be one person doing all of these things.
No. And is this, when we spoke about it as well, I think do you need a professional involved, would you say? Or if you don't, what makes it a success and a failure if you don't involve a professional?
I think the point of involving a professional, and never be afraid to have a conversation with a lawyer, an accountant, whoever the professional is that you're talking to, but with contracts, a lawyer. People come to us all the time and say, I've got this contract, how much will it cost to review? And we'll do a whole host of things. We could do a really quick red flag review to say, actually, you need to look specifically at these points. Someone might come to us with a specific question. I would get a lawyer involved because there'll be things that you might not necessarily be aware of, unless you've got kind of a contracts and legal background. You need to understand how the contract interacts with your engagement with the person. Have you spent a lot of money on a contract, but actually you only give the terms to them when you invoice them, because that's not effective? Are you accidentally signing up customer terms each time you do it, so your contract's completely pointless? I think there's always a value in having a conversation with a lawyer. How much you choose to spend on that will depend on your budget, but never be afraid of having a conversation with someone so you understand what it is that they could do to help and how much that would cost. Yeah.
Okay. No, I think that's fair. So if I can,
I would say, where you can, and certainly when you're doing those prioritizations, the highest priority ones, absolutely use a lawyer where you can, because it de-risks you, and it should save you money in the long run.
Yeah, I agree with that. We've had a question in actually, which I'm going to come to in a second, because I think it's very, very pertinent.
I must stop nodding my head, sorry.
No, it's quite all right.
That triggers my vertigo.
You are very high up on that chair, Nikki.
I know.
Right. Okay. I'm conscious of time now. So we have covered the ground that we wanted to cover. We've covered relationship contracts, why those matter, which ones to prioritize. We've covered your internal documents, which ones to prioritize, order, that kind of thing, and how they can have a big impact on your business's performance. And we've covered off what to do if things aren't quite right. Or find it, audit it, chip away at it one at a time, if I can summarize the last sort of 55 minutes. Nikki, would you like to close us out? And I want anyone who's got to go to finish the webinar, and then we're going to do Q&A because we have had questions in, and Diane and Nikki have both agreed to hang around for a few minutes after the official deadline to make sure everything is answered. So please don't think it's too late. Drop any other questions into the chat. Nikki, over to you.
Yeah, well, I would just say, because there's so much in there, because there are so many different documents, so many different processes, etc. We do record all of these webinars, so don't worry if you haven't written down notes fast enough or anything. You can have the delight of going to our YouTube channel, subscribing, and so you get all the future ones, and then go to whichever bit. If you have to pop off now, you can go and just watch the end bit, or there's a bit that you want to re-review. But don't also be afraid that, as Di did mention, any decent lawyer or accountant that you need advice from these things should be able to give you an initial consultation without commitment. So do go and see where you need help.
Could I just say, Nikki, actually, we've got a few people having to drop out. I'm going to pop Diane's LinkedIn details in the chat. If anybody does want to connect with Diane, I believe she's open and available to that sort of thing.
Very efficient.
It's all right. A few people flying off, but yes, Nikki.
Yes. So yes. So I would just go. I think absolutely just summarize again what you've all said. Make sure that you are logical. Make sure that you have things stored centrally where you can, if it's not confidential, obviously. Make sure that you have the right. One thing we didn't mention: training. Make sure your teams are trained with how to use these documents correctly. It's no good having processes, etc., if you don't train your team to follow the processes. So I think that was probably the only final thing I'd just add to that.
Wonderful. Okay, well, Diane, thank you. Nikki, thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. It's been wonderful. Right, let's move on to Q&A. So questions we've had. Someone has asked, this is the one that I wanted to bring in. Someone's asked, I've felt this before. Where is the line when you talk to a lawyer about, I've just got a quick question about XYZ. Where is the point where I should assume I will pay?
So you shouldn't have to assume you'll be paying, you should be told. The line depends on what practice area you're talking to. If you talk to an employment lawyer with a quick question, you're likely to be paying quite early on, because you're likely to get the answer quite early on. A lot of the clients that I deal with, we have to do a lot of scoping almost. We have to understand the business, we have to understand what they need, we then agree what it is we're going to do for them. So I could have a 45-minute conversation with a client where actually they don't get the answer, but I get the information I need in order to be able to tell them how much it'll cost to help them. Whereas my employment colleague Julie might have a 45-minute conversation with someone and she solves their problem. So I think always, have an upfront conversation with a lawyer about costs. People do it all the time. Just sort of say, I assume I'm not paying, am I? Unless you tell me, and just be really clear about it. Don't feel like you can't have that conversation with people.
Yeah, never be afraid to ask the question. You can't get charged for that. You get charged for listening to the answer. Okay, that's a good. So
that's similar from accounting as well, because often people might phone through and ask certain questions. Some things you're happy to just go, point them in the right direction or something. But if it is a big, complicated area, it's quite possible that we might need several meetings before we actually quote and then proceed with something. So, it can vary. But again, all professional qualified accountants, like qualified solicitors, would be open with their pricing policies.
Okay. Yeah, good answers, I think. Hopefully that's answered the question. Another one, this was actually from much earlier in the webinar, but we couldn't fit it in. When it comes to supplier contracts, are some things easier to negotiate than others? Are there some things you just shouldn't bother with, I think is what they're trying to get at with their question.
Part of this depends. Supplier contracts are difficult. It depends on your bargaining power. It depends on the supplier that you're dealing with.
Mm.
The bigger the supplier, the more likely they are to say these are our terms. We don't do anything else. And then what you need to be able to do is make a cost risk decision. And the decision is, do I understand what the risk is in signing this contract? Is the fee that I'm getting paid in signing this contract sufficient to incentivize me to take that risk, or should I try to negotiate? It's always worth trying to negotiate something. You'll be surprised what you can change. I'd focus on your key areas though. Let go of things that really don't matter to you and focus on things like liability, about payment terms, risk. Work out what your key areas are where you just can't move. And also talk to your insurance company, because if you're being asked to sign an unlimited liability contract, some insurance companies really have issues with those. So do talk to your insurance companies, involve other people in your stakeholder group, so that you know where their expectations are around what you will and won't agree.
Yeah, I guess coming back and saying, if I sign this, my insurance is invalid.
Yeah.
Is a different conversation too. I don't want to sign this because I don't like it.
Yeah, and I think if you can explain to, a big contracting party what the point is, and if you can explain why it's relevant in the context of your contract, because sometimes you'll get you see contracts that are hundreds of pages long and half of it's completely irrelevant to whatever it is that you're supplying, because there's no intellectual property or there's no this or no that. And if you can explain the context and get the person to understand, you can have a much easier time of trying to make it something that's appropriate. You won't always succeed, and then it is literally a cost risk decision.
Okay, yeah, that's a good answer. You must have seen multiple different ways. What's the best way to store them? I think this harks back to what you were talking about, Nikki, having yours, and also the room version. But what is the best way to store contracts so that they are used?
Well,
I'm going to add that one in on the top.
We personally have got a company server, so it's there, and then everyone can access them. So, but you might have them in. I suppose actually saying that, in some of the software that we use now, because like Di said before, you use more electronic signing, so we have that within the software that we're using to our practice letter of engagement software that we use. It's all within that, so that it's always got the right version.
Is there any risk there? I've literally just thought of this because I was once taught to never keep I do top cash back, never leave your money there because it's not really a legal requirement for them to give it you type of thing. Is there a issue with keeping the storage of those electronically signed documents just in the software? If they went bust or downhill, are you exposed because you can't access your contracts, Diane?
I would always keep things wherever you store. I wouldn't get too hung up on where you store them to start off with. Some people like hard copy, more people are moving to electronic. I had a call this morning with a client to go through their contract, and they keep everything on Google Drive. Whatever is appropriate to your business, but always have a backup. So with anything in your business, if the whole thing goes down, then you need to be able to access it in order to work. So wherever it is you've stored it, as long as it's in a logical way and everyone knows where it is, and you've got kind of document traceability, so you can't have people going in and amending things and not knowing that they've amended it. I wouldn't worry too much about where you store it. Just make it somewhere logical. And as I said, keep a backup.
Yeah, no, that makes sense as well. Okay, final question now. I say the best to last. If I can't afford so this person's saying that they're effectively a complete startup. They have no spare cash whatsoever. They can't afford a solicitor, but they need these documents. What are the options for them?
I would always never assume you can't afford a solicitor. I would have the conversation with the solicitor. I talk to lots of startups, and we will have a conversation about the business, who's involved, where they're going, and then we'll put together an email that says, right, if you had unlimited cash, or ideally you would have all of these documents, and you can put a cost around them, and then the person knows you've always got like a shopping list for the future. So don't assume you can't afford, because you might be surprised. They might say, well, actually, if you want to focus on just these things, the cost is a manageable cost. As Nikki said, there are online document options. they all come with a health warning, which is that if you're getting something online, it's not tailored, it's not bespoke to your circumstances. So it might feel like it does the job, but it will need reviewed much more quickly. So yeah, just don't assume you can't. I would always have the conversation, know what it is that you need, and then think about how you might be able to factor in the cost for those things. And then, as Nikki said, some documents you can get from the FSB, your web designer might be able to give you a privacy policy and a cookie policy, website browsing terms. There are different ways of getting things as part of the packages that you're already paying for.
Yes, yeah, yes. There's never assume you can't afford something, no matter how talented and high performing the lawyer in question may be. Okay, that was the end of the questions. We've only got a few attendees left with us now. I think the people who wanted to have their questions answered. So I think we can round it up there. Thank you everyone for joining us.
Super, thank you so much, everybody. Thank you all the attendees, and thank you in particular to our lovely speaker, Diane, and Pete as being a brilliant host.